Glenn Beck, we need 1 billion people. We need 1 billion people in the U.S. And we know what this means, right? When he says we need 1 billion people in the U.S., where do you think that that's going to come from? Do you think all of a sudden Americans are just going to start having children and having big families, without any sort of policy change or cultural change? Of course not. What he means is that we need 1 billion immigrants. This is what he means. We need to open the borders. We need to have no borders. This is what Glenn Beck is saying when he says we should have 1 billion immigrants. And this is right along the lines of some of the people during the Groyper Wars, right? Charlie Kirk, Matt Walsh, others like this, who were advocating for basically the same thing, which is why the Groyper Wars began in the first place, which is why we targeted them, trying to push them in the right direction in terms of immigration, social and cultural issues, and this is still an ongoing thing, of course, as we can see. And the question you have to ask yourself is, when you see things like this, before we dive into this, when you see things like this, when you see statements like this coming from Glenn Beck or statements like this coming from Charlie Kirk, where he said that, we have room in the country for 52 million or more immigrants, because look at the space between Reno and Chicago. When you see statements like this, you have to ask the question, what is the difference between Glenn Beck, Charlie Kirk, and liberals? What is the difference between people like Glenn Beck, Charlie Kirk, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and liberals, and the left, and Joe Biden, whose plan will allow 52 million immigrants to settle in the United States of America if he gets elected, who promised to end deportations for the first 100 days of his presidency, who promised to do the Gang of Eight amnesty plan. What is the difference? Well, truly, the result is the same. Truly, there is no difference between these mainstream conservatives, these conservatarians, as we like to call them, these libertarians, who are presenting themselves as conservatives, but truly they are just open borders, Cato Institute type libertarians. There is no difference between them. The end result is the same. We lose. We lose, we get hunted down in the streets, quite literally, and Republicans never win an election ever again. The conservative values that we believe in, the traditional values that we believe in, never see the light of day again, under either of these people, under either of these plans. And so we'll read a little bit here from Breitbart report. It says, having 1 billion Americans is a goal worth striving for and crucial to keeping China from overtaking us as the top global power. Beck tweeted after a conversation with the progressive author Matt Iglesias, who recently published a book urging the tripling of the U.S. population from 330 million to 1 billion people. Iglesias' book, 1 Billion Americans, The Case for Thinking Bigger, calls for roughly 670 million additional residents, including both immigrants and native-born. In 2013 and 2014, Iglesias supported the Gang of Eight amnesty, which would have flooded the U.S. labor market with approximately 30 million in 10 years, boosted investors over wage earners, and shifted political powers toward the pro-diversity progressives who are increasingly allied with Wall Street. Iglesias is a top editor at the progressive site Vox.com, and this is what he told Beck. Now, when we think about this in terms of gun rights, when we're trying to find a difference between Glenn Beck and Iglesias or any other liberal, let's think about gun rights. Well, rhetorically, Glenn Beck supports guns, right? Rhetorically, he supports the Second Amendment. But what does 1 billion or more people, or 300 million immigrants, and their birth rates being higher than the native-born American citizens in order to reach this 1 billion mark? What is the end result of that in terms of gun rights? Well, we know the polling on this. 70% of Hispanic Americans think that it's more important to control gun ownership than to protect gun rights. 80% of blacks think this way. What about free speech? I'm sure that outwardly, on the surface, there's a difference between Glenn Beck and Iglesias or any other liberal as far as free speech is concerned. But once again, what is the end result of what Glenn Beck is advocating for? Well, we know the polling on this as well. 70% of Hispanic Americans think that hate speech is violence. And additionally, 60% of Hispanic Americans say that we should criminalize hate speech. 80% of black Americans think that hate speech is violence. Additionally, 70% of black Americans think that we should criminalize hate speech. Asians fall right around this line as well, because we're seeing a shift in immigration right now from largely Hispanic immigration to Asian immigration. It's about to even out, I think, or it already has evened out. So gun rights, end result is the same. Free speech, end result is the same. The Republican Party as a whole, conservative values in the end result is the same. Liberals take control forever. So really, there is no difference between Glenn Beck and any liberal that you hear speaking on CNN or any neoliberal in the United States government. Really, there is no difference between Glenn Beck and a progressive because what they're advocating for results in the same. And so I'm going to play this. Actually, I don't even need to play that clip, but he's being slammed online, right? And so we're looking at a couple of responses from this tweet. It says they want 1 billion Americans so that they can depress wages like they did in China. Not only that, they want degradation of the environment, the depreciation of natural resources, and declines in individuals' quality of life, all for the sake of GDP. Only oligarchs want that. And that's absolutely correct. And we're going to talk about the wage effect on this in a minute here, but it says Beck agreed with Iglesias, but argued that incomers should work hard, speak English, and accept the civic and constitutional principles of the United States of America. He says, quote, I'm glad to hear you... Iglesias says, I'm glad to hear you say that. Iglesias responded, I wish that all conservatives thought the way that you're thinking about immigration. But as long as they come here, right? As long as we have the Constitution, as long as they come here and they work hard and they speak English, but that's not what's happening. But that's not what's happening just after 60 million immigrants came over here over a period of 60 years, which is tiny in comparison to what Glenn Beck is advocating for here. We have a record 67 million people speaking a language other than English at home. We have a record number of students per capita who are English language learners. Why? Because they're not assimilating, because they're coming over here at such numbers that they don't need to assimilate. They come over to the country and they settle in these enclaves and they don't need to assimilate, particularly because Spanish is the same throughout many Central and South American countries, aside from one country, Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. There's a little bit of a difference with Asian immigration, where the assimilation process is a little bit more difficult, considering the diversity in language in Asia, throughout Asia. But once again, the end result is the same. In fact, Asians even vote more Democrat than Hispanic. So we're screwed either way. It says, if you're coming here to be able to say, I want to be a part of this without shedding who you are and what you thought, but melt into this, you're still holding up civic and constitutional principles, not just the flag, not just that jingoistic crap. I hate that stuff because it obscures the principles that made us different. And if you hold up those principles, that's it. I think what most people are worried about, the deep change. So that's Glenn Beck. I don't need to play the clip. Most of you have seen the clip. I think we played a little bit of it yesterday, but I want to talk about the wage effect. So when that person responds to Glenn Beck saying that only oligarchs want this, absolutely correct. The reason why these corporations advocate for mass immigration, the reason why these corporations advocate and lobby for things like H-1B for high-skilled immigrants and mass immigration for low-skilled immigrants is because they can bring them in here and pay them a lower wage and fuck over the American worker. So in every way, what Glenn Beck and other mainstream conservatives and a lot of people in the GOP are advocating for is a complete destruction of everything that we believe in as conservatives and a complete destruction of the country. It's what oligarchs want. So if we look at the plan that Glenn Beck has in mind, which is basically complete open borders, imagine there's no countries, right? Like the John Lennon song goes. Is that John Lennon? I could be wrong. Whatever. It slipped my mind very briefly here. But imagine there's no countries, right? We hear this sung at the we heard this song at the Democratic National Convention, I believe. We hear these Hollywood stars sing this in these like compilation mashups. So we have an increase in world GDP of $40.1 trillion, and this is what they're talking about here. They're saying that in order to compete with China as an economic superpower, we need 1 billion Americans here, because it will substantially increase our GDP. And then in terms of GDP, in terms of being an economic superpower to keep pace with China, this is what we're going to see happen. $40.1 trillion increase in GDP. This is according to 2013 numbers. Number of movers, 5.6 billion people. So this is the high number, right? Wage change in the North America, negative 39.3%. Wage change in the South, plus 143%. Increase in world GDP after accounting for migration costs, $28 trillion. So the oligarchs look at this and they say, well, shit, the GDP is growing. We're becoming an economic superpower. We're able to keep pace with China. Fuck the American worker. Fuck the guy in the middle. Screw small businesses. This is what we're looking at, and this looks good to us. And this is what Glenn Beck is advocating for here. And then we move on, and we look at the wage change even further here, and this breaks this all down. And so this is the short-run immigration surplus based on real numbers since 1965. So we're talking about the wage effect based on real numbers. So what we just went over was this imaginary plan. Imagine there's no countries. Imagine there's no borders, and everyone can free flow, to whichever country that they want. This is real numbers. This is what we have seen so far. This is from 2015, and it says immigration surplus, $50.2 billion. So there is a surplus, but it's a marginal surplus. It's an irrelevant surplus. It's a negligible surplus when all things are considered. Loss to native workers, $515.7 billion. Gains to native firms, $565.9 billion. There's a pretty massive increase in GDP. But guess what? Most of that positive that we saw as far as in terms of the surplus is concerned and the GDP, when you consider this, most of the surplus goes right back to the immigrants themselves and right back to the corporations that are advocating and lobbying for, these millions of people to come over to the country at every level, whether it's what they call low-skilled immigration, low-wage immigration, or high-wage immigration with the H-1Bs, where we've seen things like Disney and Microsoft and many other corporations get caught firing American workers and forcing them to train their foreign replacements. At every level of the economy, we see them replacing American workers and hiring people at a lower wage so that they can turn a higher profit. All for what? For what? For an increase in the GDP. And then outside of this, if we look at the transition in immigration that we have seen, we've seen this transition occur to where basically it has leveled itself out from Hispanic immigration to Asian immigration. And what's the result of this? Well, the result is the same. Like I said, 75% of Asians vote for Democrats. The majority of the Asians feel the same way on gun rights. The majority of Asians feel the same way on free speech. And then also, we keep seeing stories, like we have this story up on the redolphins.com, busted, NYPD cop caught spying for the Chinese government. We had a former CIA officer who was arrested and charged with espionage. These are people who were born in the United States of America, but they have an allegiance to the country from which their ancestors came. It's almost as if people have dual loyalties. It's almost as if people are tribal in nature. Well, don't dare say anything like this about Jews, of course, having more loyalty to Israel than America, regardless of all of the numbers that we have seen, of all of the data that we have seen confirming this, and many of the different American-born intelligence officials and government officials who have been arrested spying for Israel, still born here in America. Never say that about Jews, because then that would be anti-Semitic. But, we constantly are seeing stories like this former CIA officer, this NYPD cop, and many other Chinese individuals who are born here in America, who are arrested for spying for the country from which their ancestors came. And why are we seeing these riots in the street right now? This is also something that you should consider. Why do you think it is, Glenn Beck, that we're seeing cities burned to the ground right now? Why are we seeing what happened in Louisville happen? Why are we seeing what happened in Minnesota happen? Why are we seeing what happened in Wisconsin happen? Why are we seeing this? Why are we seeing what just happened in LA last night? Why? Is it because of socialists? Is it because of Democrats? What are these riots about? These riots are race riots. Why are we having race riots? Well, it's because we are a diverse country and increasingly becoming an even more diverse country, a less homogenous country, a less peaceful country because of this. And this is ethnic conflict. This is not conflict. These black criminals are not rampaging throughout Minneapolis and Louisville and all the rest because they're mad about the tax cuts, because they're mad about the foreign policy of President Trump, because they're mad that President Trump moved the embassy in Israel, because they're mad that there are drone strikes happening right now. They're not rampaging throughout the streets because of actual political policies. Many of these people are completely apolitical and don't vote at all and have never voted in their lives and have no intention of voting. They're rioting because of race, because of ethnic conflict. And you want to have 1 billion more people come in here and melt into society? Have we seen anyone melt into society? Why do you think there are these massive ethnic enclaves in America right now? Why do you think that people are already, if you look at the racial dot map, self-segregating in the country? These riots aren't happening because of Democrats or because of socialists or because of left-wing policies. I mean, I guess in a sense, you can look at the funding behind this, and we've talked about like the Bail Project and who's at the head of the Bail Project and George Soros and things like this, which helps keep this going. But we have to look at the people rioting in the first place. Why are they rioting? Go and ask them. Ask them why they're rioting. Well, it's because Whitey's oppressing me, and it's because of race. These are race riots. These are not socialist riots. These are not Democrat, well, they're definitely Democrat-funded riots, but the underlying base for why this is happening right now, why this is ethnic conflict. That's what this is. And you want to add more. You want to add more fuel to the fire. So just to sort of wrap this up here, we're looking at overwhelming defeat for Republicans. Like this, someone just posted this. The 2020 election result, if white people voted versus if only POC voted. So this is only if white people voted, Donald Trump with 429 electoral votes. If only POC voted, Joe Biden, it's almost like the Jeb Bush map, right? Jeb Bush wins every state. This is what would happen if only people of color voted. 538 electoral votes. That's a little bit off, a little bit of inaccurate, but the end result is the same, right? They did this with the 2016 election with the exit polling. The end result is the same. No Republican is going to win ever again, ever. And then we look at how this breaks down. They're not coming over here and melting into American culture. They're not coming over here and learning to speak English. They're not coming over here and supporting gun rights or supporting free speech rights. They're overwhelmingly against this. Most of them overwhelmingly against this on average. Doesn't matter which countries you look at. The only countries that after a generation or 2 generations assimilate into society better than any other place in the world are Northern and Western European countries. And you have to think, why is it the case that all the way up until 1965, our immigration system was pretty much solely reserved for Northern and Western European countries? Why is that? Well, let's look at language, just for one. I think it's something like 70% of Northern and Western European countries already speak English. The citizens of these Northern and Western European countries, they already speak English. 70%, 50% of Europe overall. So there's the language thing. And then the assimilation process. Why do you think it's the case that white people overall, on average, have been the only group of people in this country that vote over 50% for Republicans and over 50% for Democrats, depending on the policy, depending on the candidate? Well, it's because that group of people are the only true assimilated voter in the country. And so once again, you have to ask the question, what is the difference between Glenn Beck? What is the difference between Ben Shapiro? What is the difference between Matt Walsh? What is the difference between these a lot of people in the GOP and the left? What they're advocating for is no different. The end result is no different. My goal is to eventually become a powerhouse of truth. That is why it is imperative that you check the links in the description below and go to either Patreon and Subscribestar and support us for at least the cost of a cup of coffee a month. We already have writers writing for TheRedElephants.com, but we'd like to bring on more in the near future. By the way, at TheRedElephants.com, you can also find t-shirts, hats, and other products. Check the links in the description below. It helps us out tremendously.